Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the second one of these Foresight from Insight sessions. And yesterday, whilst I talked about signals in the market and things that we can look to, today I'm going to talk about really the future of global meat supply. And to do that, the focus is going to be talking about really the availability of meat for export, because for those of us taking part in this event, I think that's the most interesting thing and the most troublesome thing perhaps for us to get our heads around, especially given the 18 months that we've been through, firstly with ASF and the disruption of China buying and how that pulled product away from some of the markets, and then with COVID and the changes in consumer patterns. So availability is really on all of our minds. Now, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Rupert Claxton. I work for Gira. Gira is a European-based food industry consultancy. We specialize in meat, dairy, and bakery, and we have a team of consultants, analysts, and experts who are based all around the world and feed into our system all the time on what is going on, the key issues, and what we need to keep an eye on. So it's with that behind me that I have the pleasure of sharing some thoughts with you from our annual Global Meat Club work and talking about what's going on. So to talk about supply, I'm going to talk about the global production outlook. That's a good place to start. How much is there available in the market? And then I'll shift that to the big exporters, because that's really what we want to talk about. And then I'm going to do a little bit on consumer pressure, because I think understanding the changing forces behind what people want is going to help understand what we're going to need to change in the supply chain and also what people are asking for. And I'll leave you with some final thoughts, and hopefully we'll be about 20 minutes. So the global production outlook, these are the big picture numbers behind what we do. And so Gira works by adding these numbers up around the world, and we try and come back and have an idea of how much meat is available in the world market. And so this shows over the last 10 years, back to 2009, the total global consumption and consumption and production equal each other, but different places in the world, and how it's changed. And you can see that pre-ASF, there was a pretty strong growth trend, somewhere between 1.5% and 3%, very nearly 3% per annum. That's generated really by demand growth in the developing world. We see a little bit of demand growth in somewhere like the US, but the demand growth in China, in the developing economies of Indonesia, the Philippines, even some of the Central and South American countries, and Africa, that's where the surge in demand remains. Because as disposable incomes increase, people want to eat more meat, and they spend that disposable income on more meat. What we see is, when we look just broadly at the numbers, that pork has held on. This is this pinky peachy color in the middle pretty well, but actually it's chicken that's been growing fastest, this yellow color here, which is all poultry meat, but chicken is the area that grows the fastest. Whereas sheep and goats in the blue and beef in the red, actually the growth is much more marginal. It is still growing. There are some issues around the world with cattle cycles, with the drought in Australia and those kind of things. But because of the investability, because of their price at retail, because of how fast you can generate a return on them, it's really been pork and poultry that have dominated. And pork has held on very well, really because of its importance in the Chinese market. So you see the dip here, and we talked about this yesterday with ASF in China, sharp decline in pork production as we lose something like 24 million tons of production in China. It's more than that once you factor in Vietnam and the Philippines. And then if you want to look at the knock-on effect around the world, then you can start to balance that out. We see some growth in other markets to counter it. Whereas chicken continued to grow through this period, it grows faster because of ASF as it tries to fill the pork gap, but it can't grow. It's slowed by COVID because we see some demand issues in certain markets. That's the big picture. That's just what is there in the world market. We can't invent meat. It has to come out of that pool of availability. But we know a large element of it is traded. So the big exporters are worth just mulling over for a minute. And really, when it comes down to trade, and the one that's missing is India for buffalo, but otherwise, the really big exporters of these four regions: US, Brazil, and Europe. And the reason we focus, and then Australia for beef again. And the reason we focus on those is because typically they have a very cost competitive position. The volumes are very large. And they're pretty representative of what we're seeing. We know, we can add in Thai chicken, especially cooked. We could add in beef from Uruguay or Argentina. There are a number of other things that could be in here, and Russia increasingly making its presence felt, although the reality is the volumes are still quite small. So what we see in the US is a country that typically exports the parts of the animals that they don't eat in their domestic market. So we see in terms of pork, we see things like hams and picnics coming out of the market. We are seeing and feet and head meat for China. We've seen some half carcasses going out as well. And then in terms of the chicken, it's leg quarters. In Europe, we see a lot of same kind of story, the things that we don't need in the market. But here from the pigs, we see some ribs and some bellies, which the US market consumes itself. And then in chicken terms, we typically see spent hens and again, some leg meat and feet. Brazil's really notable because what they're shipping is a whole range of product produced for export. So the whole animal is bred and reared to hit the export market. So there we see the whole range of cuts. In Australia, it's beef and sheep meat. They are one of the global forces in sheep meat. They are notable in beef. And that's been disrupted by drought in the last, well, really over the last 6 or 7 years, as we've been through a cycle of droughts, that's been on and off. What's notable though is we look at all bar Australia, we see the volumes have been increasing. They've been increasing to take advantage of the opportunity in China. And that's been the story of stress. And we've got a look at dislocation in Europe here. This growth that we see from 2019 into 20 is caused by the Brexit effect. And so we started to account for product that moves between the EU 27 and the UK market in this trade now. So that's why you see a jump up in European trade. It is growing, but not at the rate shown there. In terms of total pork exports, it's worth understanding, the same process. Who is it that's supplying most of the world's supply and what's going on? So notable that the volumes have been growing. They're disrupted again here between 19 and 20 because you see the EU volume jumps. That's as we take into account the volume moving from EU 27 into the UK market. But big volumes from going around the world. So let's take 2019, pre-COVID as a good benchmark. EU is already the world's biggest supplier with 2 notable exporters in there, Germany and Spain, but also a range of others, Belgium, France, the UK at that point, Denmark. Big volumes coming out onto the world market. The US, significant export volumes and growing, and with an intent to be a more notable export force. Those volumes have been growing for the last decade. And then Canada, smaller volumes, but still significant. One of the things to factor in is there's a lot of trade between Canada and the US, but they are both notable exporters into the Asian region. And then Brazil, volumes growing quite strongly, with a much more focused look at what's going on in the Brazilian opportunity for them. They don't ship into the European market, and they've had problems in their domestic market, which has encouraged them to export more. So there is more available. We've seen that the major exporters have robbed their domestic market to have. That means product that would normally have been consumed, say in Brazil, because the economic situation is weak and because the opportunity in China is strong, those exporters have taken that product overseas. We've seen the same in Europe and in the US. COVID heightened that effect because food service was weak. It meant there was more availability, even with the disruption to slaughtering that we saw in a number of markets last year. Recovery of domestic market will absorb some of that volume that's going to China. So as we come away from COVID, and this is true of all species, and we see the economy recovering in Europe, in the US, and food service opening up most notably, then some of that product won't be available. So growth is a little bit slower in 2021. Probably in 2022, that impact will be most notable. COVID's still a big problem this year. And we talked about COVID in a bit more detail yesterday, and I think the recordings are available, so you can go back and find that. Poultry, again, notable, same sort of countries involved. US down here, most of this is leg quarter, very low cost product, MDM as well. Again, aggressively priced. When it comes into an import market, it's disruptive, but actually it fills a really important need. There is a need for that low cost protein in a number of developing countries around the world. Yes, disrupted to local production, but it provides protein for that growing bottom end demand. Brazil, the biggest exporter of chicken around the world, notably very good at doing all sorts of parts into markets, but struggling with high feed costs. And in poultry, that's really notable in 2021. High feed costs are probably going to blunt the upper end of production growth because companies are losing money where that price is today. Then you see the European lift, and you see this lift here between, again, 19 to 20 is about the Brexit discussion, but we continue to grow into 2021. That's about looking at that opportunity in other Asian markets, about exporters being better connected. And then you see the Thai export growth again, and really notably fueled by their extra access into China that they've enjoyed through the last 2 years. But they're finding the prices have come down. Where those prices in China were really good 6 months ago, then they're not as high as they were. And that really largely due to US leg quarter coming into the Chinese market at the moment. The balance in trade is always better for a producer to keep the product where they get the highest price in their domestic markets. That's typically because they can sell it chilled, where the premium is attached to it. Once you freeze it for export, prices fall. But the reality is that a number of those export operators don't have enough domestic market for the production that they've got, and so they have to get out to export. And that's true across the species. So any of these markets couldn't absorb that product on their domestic market. And so to keep their domestic prices high, they have to keep exporting a share of production. In beef, there are a lot more exporters of beef, and I sort of hinted at that earlier. Slow developments in beef production limit trade availability. We just don't see, the cycle takes 7 years in terms of the cattle cycle. If you bring more cattle in, how long before you get a really sustained production growth? The reality is it's very capital intensive. People don't want to invest in it. It's a very traditional production system. Okay, we're seeing more going on to feedlot, which increases the slaughter weights. But the reality is there isn't that much more available in the world, or at least there aren't that many more cattle available. We could slaughter a few more in India and Africa for sure. But in the US, Brazil, across South America, really, Australia, New Zealand, we're not talking huge growth in production. That means trade is limited. And so it comes out of diverting product from one market to another when the prices change, looking for where the best opportunities are. And so, yes, we see some growth, but a very slow year in 2020 because of COVID, because of the downturn in food service, and also because of disruption of slaughtering. Balance as we go back into 2021, a few more cattle available for slaughter, and the demand recovery will take some product out of stock. The reality is, though, trade is increasing at the expense of domestic markets around the world. Mid-term expectation is for growth in demand in China, but it limits availability on the global market. There is not a limitless amount available, so product gets diverted to China from other countries. India has huge potential. There is still a lot of buffalo, both exported and consumed in India. And notably, India here in this pink peachy color in the middle, really down in 2020 because of disruption in their labor from COVID last year and in their ability to move around the country and buy up buffalo for slaughter. The expectation is that recovers partially in 2021 and will get better in the outlook. They also consume quite a lot of buffalo in their domestic market. That could be exported. It provides a really good, low quality, low cost, not low quality, bovine protein, really popular for curries and things across Southeast Asia, has an important role in the market. It's not going to compete head on with Australian grass-fed or European grass-fed, and certainly not with grain-fed beef across the world, but it fills a role in the market. It's premium beef for me that the availability of is going to get tighter and tighter as we look out over the next 5 years, and you have to factor that in your buying. Consumer pressure is the other end of the spectrum. What we're finding is that consumers are changing the sort of communication they give to governments and to the retailers and food service companies, and that adds cost, complexity, and it means that the industry has to factor that in. We've got to be accountable to our consumers now. It's no good to go, well, people really want that. They do. They might not be prepared to pay for it. And we're seeing really disruptive communication. This is slightly old, this one, but we've seen a number of messages go around from the same organization. It's very clearly a go vegan message. It misinterprets publications that are out there, and we've got to get used to this factor. These disruptions will come and go. In fact, they're not as disruptive as you might think. But we see short-term changes, and the slow trickle-down effect is that consumers are thinking harder about what is it they want to eat. How much meat do they really need in their diet? And so, 18 years ago when I started in Gira, the discussion around flexitarian, no one would have known what it was. 5 years ago, the term flexitarian was beginning to pop up, but really wasn't understood. 2 years ago, we were, oh, there's this new thing, flexitarian. The reality is the trend's always been there. People are changing their demand, how they eat meat. And I'll give you the example of my grandfather, who was a farmer. He might have eaten meat 3 times a day. He might have had some bacon at breakfast, some sort of ham product possibly for lunch, and certainly some meat at dinner. That means that across a week of 7 days, he had 21 opportunities to consume meat. Whereas now, I very rarely have meat for breakfast, very rarely have it for lunch, but normally have it maybe 5 times a week in my dinner. So we've gone in 2 generations from 21 opportunities to 5 or 6, and that's getting worse. So we have to understand that mechanism, but it's a developed world discussion. Other things that are going on in consumers' heads, I mean, clearly flexitarian feeds into this meat alternative, fake meat discussion. We're seeing more of these products. The quality of them is getting better. They're getting closer to meat in the way that they mimic it, but also the consumer is less concerned about it being exactly like meat, and it's now just another protein center for the plate. That's a real discussion. The sustainable development goals, people, profit, planet, how do we fit that discussion in? And we're beginning to see big food service companies trying to factor that into the way that they source their meat supply chain. Animal welfare, very clearly a message. It's one that you just have to be on the right side of. You can't get caught the wrong side of the welfare discussion. And if it catches the press that your brand has bought product that comes from somebody who is abusing animals, there is a problem. So auditable supply chains, where you're proving that you're doing something to sort this out. You've got to show that you're making efforts. Food safety is taken as a given now in a lot of countries, but less so in Asia. You need to deliver safe food, and you need to, again, be sure that you're proving you're doing everything you can. The WHO, the discussion around cancer and meat, hasn't gained the traction it could have done, which is a good thing for the meat industry, but it is there. And then intervention technology, and most notably antibiotics in meat production, has been another one. And consumers are aware of these. They don't really understand them, but that doesn't mean the industry doesn't have to take on board and change. And we've seen that US food services very quickly moved away from chicken raised with antibiotics. Somewhere over 60% of chicken in the US now raised without antibiotics. Then we had the panic buying phenomenon of COVID. Supermarkets shelves stripped bare, and we had hundreds of photos of these from last year. That did make people more aware of whether or not meat was available. They are thinking a little harder about the supply chain behind meat. That's great news. But we have to be aware that people expect meat to be in front of them. How do we guarantee that? The flexitarian one I've been through, US, they're saying that 29% of consumers identify as flexitarian. For me, it's a real challenge. I'm not a flexitarian because I eat less meat. You have to actively reduce your meat consumption and do it for a reason to qualify in this bracket. But the maths is woolly. What's important for me is that that's 30% of the market in the US, whereas vegan and vegetarian are only 6% combined. So this flexitarian discussion is really important to where we're going. And that's got to be factored into what is the market going to be like in 5 years' time, and will these trends penetrate across the Asian region down into Australia and New Zealand, which are more susceptible. They're already there, really. One of the other things I talk to people a lot is where are these trends in the world? And so there was a little survey done by Mintel, which clearly proves that this discussion around healthier diets and being aware of what we're eating are global phenomena. They're not just in the developed markets. And so the example here given of Thailand, where we see that 80% of consumers were saying that they wanted to have a healthier diet. 76% want a better life-work balance, 73% to exercise more. But it all comes back to what we eat, what the consumer is going to eat. These are being communicated around the world through TV channels and programs, but increasingly social media, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and WeChat. These are really important drivers for where the market is going to be in the future. Okay, there's a lot to think about, but it's worth factoring into what we're looking at. For me, to leave you with a few final thoughts, midterm outlook is positive. The market is growing. There are more people that want to eat more meat. So it's not all doom and gloom, despite the challenges that are there. The demand for meat will increase in the midterm, but is linked to the developing world. It's about population growth and economic growth, which equals meat consumption. It's going to shift away from being about Europe, the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand. High value markets are maturing. That means they are going to reach peaks, and we're going to see consumers looking to do something different. They're going to eat less meat. They're going to buy maybe higher value. They're going to be much more focused on the production qualities. So we've got to factor that in. Consumer concerns are pushing back into production, increasing cost. Trend is led by the US and European markets, but it is coming elsewhere, accelerated by global brand position. I mean, KFC, McDonald's. Those kind of companies are really concerned about the global positioning, and we're seeing other companies following. Changing route to market is a different metric here. It's allowing developing countries to accelerate the process of modern supply chain and distribution. That's really notable. ASF has done something to accelerate that, but e-commerce solutions are going to drive it far faster and differently to what you already see in the US or European market. D2C, direct to consumer, this is one to watch. These are companies that can take their product direct from the cutting plant, the slaughter plants, and deliver them to the consumer via e-commerce channels. Amazon and the like, Tencent and Alibaba are going to be important metrics here. Food service expansion, really important in the modernization of the supply chain. And so for me, it's a really interesting time across the Asian region, because we're going to close the gap between how meat is produced, how it is traded and supplied. But all of these things also invite opportunity to do a better job of importing meat and trading it on the premium qualities that exist around that. So thank you for your time today. It's been really interesting to have an opportunity to share some thoughts with you. If you've got some questions, I think there's a mechanism now where you can either type them in or talk to me. I'm not sure how it is. I will go back to the Gira booth after this. So if you want to come there and ask me some questions on a one-on-one basis, then great. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Good luck in the year ahead, and we'll speak soon, I hope.